They said poverty had a sound, and in Ayatoro village it was laughter. It echoed through the red dust streets, bright and cruel, rolling off tongues that fed on mockery. It was not the laughter of joy, but of people who built their pride on the brokenness of others. And every time that laughter followed her, Nkem, the barefoot maize seller, felt her dreams bleed a little more. The golden sun sank over Ayatoro, coating the thatched roofs and clay walls in a glow that made even poverty look beautiful from a distance. But up close, beauty turned brittle. Women with heavy beads and loud perfume paraded the market square as if the earth itself owed them applause. Men in crisp wrappers sat beneath palm shelters, speaking in tones that measured worth in money, not in mercy. And weaving quietly among them was Nkem, slim, dark-skinned, and weary, her tray of roasted maize balanced on her head like a crown she had not yet earned. Children trailed her with mocking songs, their laughter sharp as stones. "See her dress! See her slippers!" they chanted, while the women pretended not to hear, their smiles dipped in disdain. But Nkem kept walking, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the red road disappeared into the forest. She had learned that silence could be sharper than any insult. In Ayatoro, poverty was a public sin. To be poor was to be invisible by day and ridiculed by night. The wives of chiefs often joked that Nkem's family was cursed, that no one born from her mother's womb would ever escape hunger. Her mother, Mama Ifeoma, endured the gossip like weather, quietly, without complaint. She worked long hours carrying firewood from the forest, her hands calloused, her back bent. But her voice was always gentle when she spoke to her daughter. "Child," she would say, "wealth can feed your body, but dignity must feed your soul." Nkem carried those words like armor. Each morning she rose before dawn, roasted her maize, and walked barefoot to the marketplace. Her stall was small, just 3 stones and a sheet of iron. But it was hers. Sometimes she sold nothing all day. Sometimes she went hungry so her mother could eat. Yet even when despair threatened to swallow her, she smiled. Not because life was kind, but because she refused to let the world see her break. On market days, Ayatoro was a stage. The wealthy strutted, the poor served, and laughter was the applause that kept the cruel entertained. On one such day, when the sun burned like judgment, Nkem tripped over a stone and her tray crashed to the ground. Maize rolled into the dust, scattering across the feet of the crowd. A silence fell, not from pity, but anticipation. Then came the laughter. Madame Ajoka, the richest trader in Ayatoro, stepped forward, her heavy jewels clinking like coins of arrogance. "Even the ground rejects her maize," she sneered, and the crowd erupted. Nkem knelt, her hands trembling as she picked each ear of maize from the dirt. Her eyes stung, but no tears fell. She forced her voice to remain steady. "God sees," she murmured, too softly for anyone to hear. Behind the laughter, one man watched, an old teacher named Mr. Okoro, who had long retired to Ayatoro's forgotten corner. He saw something in her that the others could not weakness, but the quiet defiance of a heart that refused to surrender. As Nkem rose, clutching her ruined maize, their eyes met. For a moment, the noise around her disappeared, and the world felt still, as if destiny itself was taking notice. The laughter returned, louder this time, mocking, relentless. Yet something inside her shifted. She realized that the people who laughed were not laughing at her hunger. They were laughing at their own fear of ever being her. She stood a little straighter, her chin lifting against the tide of cruelty. And for the first time, she looked at them not as her betters, but as proof of what she would never become. When the sun finally bled into the horizon and the market emptied, Nkem walked home alone. The path was quiet, the wind thick with the scent of rain. Her bare feet left shallow prints in the red mud, But her mind was far ahead, in a world where her name was not a joke, but a story worth telling. The stars blinked awake above her like silent witnesses. She stopped beside the old river and whispered, "One day, this same laughter will sing for me." At home, her mother was asleep beside a dying fire. Nkem sat at the doorway, the cool night brushing her face. For the first time, she did not feel small. She looked out at the darkness, her eyes alive with something fierce and quiet. That night, as the wind swept through Ayetero's sleeping huts, it carried her whisper across the hills, a promise the gods themselves paused to hear. Before dawn, destiny had already begun to stir, moving softly toward the girl the world had chosen to mock. The day began with music, color, and celebration. But by sundown, one girl's laughter would die in her throat, and her humiliation would become a story even the ancestors could not forget. In Ayetero village, the market was not merely a place to sell and buy. It was a theater of pride where reputations were built on the ruins of another's dignity. And that afternoon, under the blinding sun and the judgmental gaze of wealth, Nkem, the girl they mocked for dreaming too high, became the center of a cruel performance she never auditioned for. The drums of the harvest festival beat like living hearts, echoing through the dusty air. Women shimmered in wrappers of gold and emerald, their laughter floating like perfume. Men raised goblets of palm wine, boasting of their fortunes and lineage. The village square glowed with abundance, roasted yams steaming, pots of egusi soup bubbling, and strings of peppers gleaming like jewels in the sun. It was a day for joy, for showing the world who mattered and who did not. At the edge of that noisy splendor stood Nkem, her small stall nearly swallowed by shadows. She was barefoot, her wrapper faded, her hands darkened by charcoal from roasting maize since dawn. Yet even in her poverty, she carried herself with quiet grace. She smiled at the children who passed, waved to familiar faces, and whispered to herself as she counted her earnings. Every coin was a prayer, every roasted ear of maize a brick in the invisible road she was building toward a life beyond Ayetoro. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. As she moved through the crowd with her tray of maize balanced carefully on her head, a little boy chasing a stray chicken ran across her path. She stumbled, the tray tilted, and in an instant, golden maize scattered across the red earth, rolling into the feet of the wealthiest women in the market. The drums stopped. The laughter paused, only for a heartbeat, before it exploded. It was not laughter born of amusement. It was sharp, heavy, hungry, the kind that feeds on humiliation. From the center of the crowd, Madame Ajoke, the merchant queen, rose like a storm. She was draped in gold lace and arrogance, her head tie high as her pride. Her lips curved into a slow smile that cut deeper than any insult. "Ah," she declared, her voice dripping with scorn, "even the ground rejects her maize. How can a girl who cannot carry her dream of school?" The crowd roared with laughter, each word a dagger, each echo a wound. Nkem froze. Her heart thundered against her ribs as every gaze in that market turned to her. The sun glared into her eyes, burning through her tears. Slowly, she knelt, not in defeat, but in trembling dignity, and began to gather her maize. One by one, she picked each ear from the dust, her hands shaking, her breath short. Every piece she lifted felt heavier than the last, each kernel shining like a mirror of her broken pride. "Leave it," someone sneered. "Even dogs deserve better food." Another voice chimed in, laughing, "Go and beg at the school gate, scholar of the streets." The laughter swelled again, crueler this time, louder, endless. But deep inside that storm of mockery, something in Nkem hardened. Her humiliation no longer burned. It transformed. The shame that once weighed on her chest began to shift, making space for something new, a quiet, fierce clarity. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes finding Madame Ajoke's. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not defiance, not hate, but a promise. I will not always be this, Nkem thought, though her lips did not move. And one day, your laughter will serve me. Then, through the noise, came a sound that did not belong. A man's voice, calm, deep, and unfamiliar. Child, it said, do not let them make you smaller than you are. The crowd went still. Heads turned toward the old teacher, a quiet stranger standing beneath the baobab tree, his walking stick pressed into the earth. His eyes were steady, kind, and knowing. Nkem blinked through her tears, unsure whether to believe the gentleness in his tone. Around her, the laughter faltered, but only for a moment. Pride is stubborn. Cruelty does not like to be challenged. She rose slowly, clutching the tray to her chest. Her maze was ruined, her pride bruised, but her spirit, though battered, refused to bow. She walked past the jeering crowd, her silence louder than their mockery. As she reached the end of the marketplace, the old man's voice called again, low but certain. Girl, come back. She turned, the world blurring behind her, and met his gaze. In that single glance, the road to her destiny opened, and Ayetoro would never laugh the same way again. Sometimes, destiny does not arrive with thunder or miracles. It sits quietly beneath an old tree, watching, waiting, hidden inside an ordinary moment that everyone else ignores. That evening, when the sun bled red over Ayetoro and the laughter of the cruel still echoed in her mind, Nkem thought her day had ended in shame. She did not know that the same ground that had swallowed her tears would soon bloom with the beginning of her rise. The market had emptied, leaving behind the scent of roasted yam and the faint echoes of mockery. The dust had settled, but humiliation still clung to Nkem's skin like sweat. Her tray was empty, her eyes swollen, and her steps slow. Every sound, the rustle of palm fronds, the chirp of crickets, seemed to whisper her failure back at her. She wanted to disappear, to hide her face from a world that loved to watch the poor fall. But fate had other plans that evening, waiting just a few steps ahead, beneath the ancient baobab tree that had stood longer than the village itself. Beneath its wide roots sat Mr. Okoro, the old teacher everyone had forgotten, but whose wisdom still hummed through Ayetoro like a buried drumbeat. His back was bent with age, his hair silvered by time, yet his eyes, dim but burning, had seen more dreams rise and die than anyone dared to count. For years, he had taught children who never thanked him, fed orphans with his last coin, and watched potential wither in the sun of neglect. But when he saw Nkem stumble through the market, her maze scattered and her dignity bleeding, he recognized something familiar in her eyes, the stubborn spark of someone who refuses to stay broken. He called to her softly, "Child." She stopped, startled. No one called her that with tenderness anymore. "Come," he said, patting the wooden bench beside him. "Sit. The day has taken enough from you. Let it not take your strength, too." And Nkem hesitated. Pride battled exhaustion, but her legs gave in first. She sank beside him, her tray of burnt maize resting at her feet. "I should go," she murmured. "There's nothing left for me here." "There is always something left," Mr. Okoro said gently, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You just need to look in the right place to find it again." Sakshansat frowned, confused. "What do you see in me, sir? I am just a poor girl they laugh at." He turned his face toward her, the corners of his lips lifting slightly. "The world laughs at what it secretly fears. You have something they cannot name, so they call it foolishness. I call it fire." From his worn satchel, he drew out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were 3 old books, their covers faded, their pages thin as ash. He placed them in her hands. "Take these," he said. "They are old, yes, but inside them is a map to every place you've ever dreamed of reaching." Nkem stared at the books, trembling. "Sir, I can't pay," she whispered. He chuckled softly, the sound deep and tired, but warm. Then pay with effort. Come to my class. Learn. Each evening when the sun sets, meet me here. I'll teach you what the world has denied you. She blinked through tears. Even if I fail. He looked up at the glowing sky. Then fail bravely, child. Every failure will carve the road you'll one day walk with pride. For a long moment, silence wrapped around them. The sun dipped behind the hills, setting the clouds ablaze in orange and gold. It felt as though the heavens themselves were watching, holding their breath. That night, in her small hut where the wind whispered through cracks in the mud walls, Nkem lit a tiny lantern. The book sat before her, like sacred relics. Her hands trembled as she opened the first page, the flickering light reflecting in her eyes like twin flames. She began to read, haltingly at first, then stronger, with each word pulling her further from the girl they mocked and closer to the woman she was destined to become. Outside, the baobab tree stood silent, but its branches seemed to sway with unseen joy. Under the pale moonlight, the old teacher smiled from afar, knowing that the seed he had planted would grow into a forest strong enough to shade a nation. Nkem did not yet know it, but her story, the one they laughed at, had just found its first page. When knowledge finds its way into a heart that has known only hunger, it does not settle quietly. It burns. It consumes ignorance, lights forgotten corners of the soul, and turns pain into power. For Nkem, that fire began beneath the old baobab tree, where words replaced wounds and lessons became a new kind of weapon. The villagers laughed at her once, but soon their laughter would choke on the smoke of her rising. Each evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and Ayetero's laughter faded into distant echoes, Nkem would walk barefoot to the baobab tree. Her path was lit by the flickering glow of her tiny lantern, the same one she used to study through nights when others slept. The dust clung to her ankles, but she did not mind. Every step she took toward the tree was a step away from the version of herself that had been mocked, broken, and forgotten. Under the tree, Mr. Okoro waited, his back straight despite the years, his eyes filled with the calm patience of one who had learned that greatness is not born overnight. Around them sat 3 other children, boys from the nearby compound, but even among them, Nkem's determination shone differently. While others yawned and fidgeted, her eyes devoured every word he wrote in the dirt with his walking stick. She stumbled often at first, her tongue twisting over strange English sounds, her fingers shaky as they shaped letters into words. But each mistake only fed her hunger. When the kerosene in her lantern ran low, she studied by moonlight. When her stomach ached from emptiness, she filled it with dreams. "You learn as if your life depends on it," Mr. Okoro once said, watching her. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Because it does." The lessons were not only about language and numbers. Mr. Okoro taught her about the world, about kindness, history, and dignity. He told her that education was not just the path to power, but the proof of self-worth. "Knowledge," he said one evening, his voice deep with conviction, "is the fire that does not burn you. It burns the chains that keep you small. Remember, my child, education is revenge that doesn't bleed." Those words became her prayer. As weeks turned into months, Nkem began to change. Her voice grew stronger, her gaze steadier. She began to help the younger children who could not read, her patience a mirror of her mentors. The same villagers who had mocked her now paused when she passed. They saw the difference in her posture, her confidence, the light that seemed to follow her even when she carried no lantern. Their laughter, once cruel, had softened into whispers. "That girl," they said, "has something inside her, something dangerous." But not everyone admired her transformation. Among the students under the baobab was Chidi, the son of Madame Ajoke, the same woman who had humiliated Nkem at the market. He had joined the lessons out of boredom, but soon he noticed that the teacher's praise often fell on the poor girl who used to sell maize. It ate at him. Each night, as Mr. Okoro nodded approvingly at Nkem's quick answers and careful writing, Chidi's envy deepened like rot beneath bark. One evening, when the wind howled through the village and the lamps flickered weakly, Mr. Okoro gave Nkem a small notebook. "Write your dreams," he said. "Dreams written down become blueprints for destiny." She pressed the notebook to her chest, her eyes shining. But from the shadows, Chidi's gaze lingered on the gift, a spark of resentment glinting behind his polite smile. Soon after, the whispers of admiration in the village began to twist into something else. Envy disguised as curiosity, suspicion cloaked as gossip. "Who does she think she is?" some muttered. "A poor girl trying to be better than her betters." Others scoffed. "It is the old man's pity that makes her proud." The air around Nkem's rise began to darken, and though she did not yet see it, the path ahead would test not just her brilliance, but her spirit. That night, as she walked home beneath the moonlight, clutching her notebook, the air felt different, still heavy, as if warning her that her light had started to draw shadows. Far behind her, under the baobab tree, the last lantern flickered out. The wind carried whispers through the branches, a strange murmur that even the old teacher could not explain. And in the distance, unseen eyes watched Nkem's glow fade into the dark, their envy quietly kindling into the fire that would soon threaten everything she was building. When a light begins to shine too brightly in a place that has long worshipped darkness, shadows grow restless, and the hands that once applauded start to plot. In Ayatoro, where pride was tradition and ignorance a badge of honor, Mr. Okoro's kindness had become dangerous. His evening classes, once mocked, were now spoken of in whispers of awe. And nothing threatened the powerful more than the sight of a poor man teaching another poor soul how to dream. The baobab tree had once been a symbol of peace. Each night, children gathered beneath its great arms, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves as Mr. Okoro's voice carried through the dusk. His lessons had changed them, especially Nkem, whose brilliance had begun to outshine even the village's best-educated sons. She could now read the newspaper headlines aloud at the market, interpret proverbs the elders couldn't explain, and speak English with a grace that startled those who had once called her the Maze Girl. At first, the villagers called it a miracle. Then they began to call it witchcraft. It started with whispers. The same tongues that had once mocked her now twisted stories in the dark. "That old man has lost his mind," someone murmured at the palm wine shop. "They say he is using the girl's intelligence to get sympathy from outsiders." Another voice added, "He's teaching her to curse the rich with her tongue. You know these poor ones. They hide bitterness under humility." By the end of the week, the gossip had grown teeth. Rumors spread that Mr. Okoro had stolen money meant for the village school, that he was training rebels, that Nkem's sudden brilliance was the result of dark medicine. The proud, those who could not bear to see wisdom born from poverty, fanned the flames until they reached the ears of the village council. One afternoon, the council summoned him. The meeting was short, cruel, and final. "You are sowing unrest," they said, their robes swaying with self-importance. "Education is good, but not when it confuses people about their place." That night, when the children gathered under the baobab, Mr. Okoro did not smile. His lantern flickered weakly in the wind, his walking stick resting against the roots as if even the tree shared his sorrow. The children sensed the change. Their laughter died into silence. Nkem sat closest to him, her heart pounding with a fear she could not name. "They have ended our class," he said softly, his voice thick with exhaustion. "They say we are teaching rebellion." The children gasped. Nkem's eyes filled instantly. "But we only learn to read and write, sir," she pleaded. He nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yes, but to some that is rebellion enough." For a moment, only the wind spoke. Then Mr. Okoro reached into his satchel and drew out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He placed it gently in Nkem's trembling hands. "Your path doesn't end here," he said quietly. "It's only changing direction." Her fingers shook as she unwrapped it. Inside was a thin document, a national scholarship form, creased and slightly yellowed with age. At the top, bold letters read, "The National Excellence Award for Outstanding Young Minds." Her lips parted in disbelief. "But sir, I can't." "You can," he interrupted, his eyes glistening. "You must. Fill it out. Send it. Let your name travel where your feet cannot." Tears welled in her eyes, her voice trembling. "What about you?" He looked away, his shoulders sagging beneath the weight of injustice. "My season is ending, child. Yours is just beginning. Promise me you will keep learning, even when no one is watching." She nodded through tears. "I promise." He smiled then, tired but proud. "Good. Then I have not failed." When dawn came, the old teacher's bench beneath the baobab stood empty. His lantern, still warm, flickered one last time before the wind carried its flame into the morning light. In her small hut that night, Nkem spread the scholarship form on her table, the ink smudged from her tears. The laughter of the village still echoed outside her window, but this time it no longer wounded her. It challenged her. And as her pen touched the paper, she knew that the only way to silence them forever was not to fight, but to rise so high their voices could no longer reach her. Every story of greatness begins with a moment that feels impossible, a moment when faith must carry what flesh cannot. On the morning Nkem left Ayatoro, the sun had not yet risen, but her resolve already burned brighter than dawn. She had no money, no connections, no certainty of what waited beyond the red dust roads of her village. All she carried was her mother's blessing, Mr. Okoro's scholarship form, and the fire of humiliation that had been smoldering in her chest since the day they laughed at her in the market. What she did not know was that this single journey, barefoot, tearful, and trembling, would become the first chapter of a legend the whole nation would one day tell. The road from Ayatoro to Lagos stretched like a test of destiny. It wound through forests and fields, through villages where strangers stared at her patched dress and her tired smile. The bus she boarded groaned with age, its I-100 engine coughing like an old man's lungs. She sat by the window, clutching the small cloth bag that held her only possessions: 2 books, a pen, and a crumpled form that carried her future. Her mother's words echoed in her head. "Go, my child. Let them laugh today. Tomorrow they will call your name with respect." By the time the city appeared on the horizon, the air had changed. Lagos did not breathe like Ayatoro. It pulsed, roared, demanded. The scent of dust mixed with petrol, the sky hung heavy with smoke, and the streets never slept. Cars moved like impatient beasts, horns screaming like arguments between gods. The noise, the chaos, the faces, everything overwhelmed her. Yet deep inside, she felt something powerful, a pulse that whispered, "You belong here." Just not yet. She found work in a small tailoring shop owned by an old widow named Mama Ireti, who paid her little but allowed her to sleep in a corner behind the sewing machines. The floor was hard, the nights colder than the village wind, but it was safe. Every morning, before dawn, Nkem swept the shop and fetched water from the public tap, her hands raw from work. By day she scrubbed floors in nearby offices, invisible among the rush of men in suits and women in heels. By night, under the weak yellow light of a single bulb, she opened her books and studied, the same lessons Mr. Okoro had once taught her beneath the baobab tree. There were days when hunger blurred her vision. Her stomach gnawed at itself, her head throbbed from exhaustion, but she refused to stop. She would whisper to herself as she read, "They laughed at me, but this pain is my teacher. Every page I finish is another laugh silenced." When she learned that the scholarship examination would be held at a college across the city, she used her savings, every naira she had, to buy the cheapest bus fare. The morning of the exam, she wore her cleanest dress, ironed carefully under Mama Ireti's guidance. The bus broke down twice, and she arrived late, dust clinging to her feet, sweat soaking her collar. The examiners frowned as she entered, but one look at her determined eyes silenced any reprimand. She sat at the desk, her hands trembling as she opened the paper. The first question looked foreign, distant, impossible. But then she heard Mr. Okoro's voice in her mind, steady, calm, patient. Education is revenge that doesn't bleed. And suddenly, the fear vanished. Her pen moved like a blade slicing through doubt. Every answer was a promise, every line of ink a declaration that her worth was not for others to define. When the bell rang, signaling the end, she looked down at her paper. Pages filled, mistakes crossed neatly, handwriting steady and proud. She exhaled for the first time in hours and whispered, "Thank you, sir." The weeks that followed were harder. The exam ended, but survival continued. She cleaned more floors, skipped more meals, and prayed harder than ever before. Setkers, night, she would lie awake, listening to the hum of generators, clutching the scholarship form like a shield against despair. Then, one humid afternoon, as she scrubbed the steps outside a bank, a radio inside the security booth began to play the national news. She would have ignored it until she heard the words that froze her breath. And in the National Excellence Scholarship, the top score nationwide belongs to Miss Nkem Obi from Ayatoro Village, Ogun State. The brush slipped from her hand. Water spilled across the steps. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. The guards turned to stare as she sank to her knees, tears streaming freely down her face. For the first time, she did not hide them. At that moment, the noise of Lagos disappeared. She saw her mother's face, Mr. Okoro's smile, and the laughter of the villagers, no longer mocking, but echoing back from a distance they could never cross again. That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Nkem stood on the rooftop of Mama Ireti's shop, holding the radio close to her chest. The wind carried her name across the streets of Lagos, across fields and villages, all the way back to Ayatoro, where, for the first time, silence fell on those who had once laughed the loudest. When the poor rise, even heaven pauses to listen. The world that once laughed begins to stutter, unsure of its place before the very soul it tried to bury. And when Nkem's name echoed through the nation, not as an object of pity, but as a symbol of triumph, the air itself seemed to change. Those who had mocked her now turned their faces toward the sound of her voice, and even the proud learned that destiny has a memory sharper than scorn. The next morning after the announcement, Lagos awoke to her story. Newspapers on street corners bore her face, a girl with tired eyes and an unstoppable smile. The headline read, "From Street Vendor to National Scholar." It spread like wildfire. Bus drivers shouted her name in traffic. Students across the country whispered about the girl from a forgotten village who had defeated thousands. And in Ayatoro, where laughter had once been her wound, radios crackled her name in every home. In Madame Ajoke's courtyard, the same marketplace queen who had once crushed Nkem's pride sat silently, her gold bangles still, her teacup untouched. The radio's voice trembled with emotion. The National Excellence Award goes to Miss Nkem Obi, who scored the highest mark in the history of the program. For a long moment, Madame Ajoke did not breathe. The memory of the market floor, the maze, the laughter, the girl, replayed in her mind. Her chest tightened, and for the first time in years, tears rolled down her cheeks, heavy with guilt she had no words for. In Ayatoro's dusty streets, children gathered around the shopkeepers' radios, cheering when they heard her name. Women who once whispered cruelty now sighed with admiration. "She was just a poor girl," they murmured. "But see how she has shamed even the proud." Nkem's mother sat outside their hut, her hands trembling as she listened, her heart swelling with pride too large for her small home to contain. "You have done it, my child," she whispered to the wind, her voice breaking. "You have turned their laughter into applause." In Lagos, reporters swarmed. The Scholarship Foundation invited her to interviews, and television lights replaced the flicker of her lantern. Yet amid the chaos, Nkem remained composed. She spoke softly, her humility unshaken. "I did not climb alone," she told them. "There was a man who taught me under a tree, and a mother who believed when no one else did." The nation listened. Social leaders quoted her words. Youth organizations called her the new face of Nigerian hope. Soon after, she was invited to speak at a national youth summit, a grand event held in the capital's glittering conference hall. The crowd was massive, a sea of faces waiting to hear from the girl who had risen from dust to destiny. Standing on that stage, under the bright white lights, she felt her heart race. Her palms were slick, her knees trembling. She took a breath, remembering the market, the laughter, Mr. Okoro's voice whispering through memory. "Speak truth, even when your voice shakes." Her voice did shake at first, thin as wind through leaves, but as she spoke it deepened, steady, fierce, alive. "I was once the girl they laughed at," she said, her eyes scanning the hall. "I sold maize barefoot in a market where dreams were a luxury. I know what it means to be invisible, to be called unworthy. But I stand before you now to say, I am not the laughter you remember. I am the dream you tried to bury, and it has learned to grow even without sunlight." The hall erupted. People stood, applauding, some in tears. In that moment, Nkem's name became more than just a headline. It became a promise. Her story traveled across borders, carried by newspapers, radio stations, and hearts that longed for hope. Sponsors reached out, offering to fund her university education abroad. She began to appear in magazines, on television, and in schools where children whispered her quotes like prayers. But with every praise came a shadow. The more people celebrated her, the more her old fears stirred beneath the surface. At night, when the noise of fame faded, she would sit by the window of her dormitory, staring out at the glittering city lights, wondering if she was becoming what she once despised, proud, untouchable, distant from those who still walked barefoot in the dust. And in her dreams, the voice of her old village would return, laughter faint but familiar, asking softly, "Have you forgotten us?" One evening, as applause thundered around her after another televised interview, Nkem caught her reflection in a glass wall, confident, elegant, powerful. But for a brief second, she didn't recognize the woman looking back. The smile was perfect, but the eyes, they belonged to someone she had promised never to become. And deep within her, the same voice that once carried her through pain whispered again, "Be careful. Pride wears many faces." Fame is a mirror. It flatters before it devours. It tells you that you've escaped the hunger of yesterday, only to feed you a new kind of starvation, the hunger for more. When Nkem first stepped into the world of cameras and applause, she believed success would heal every scar the village left on her heart. But as the lights grew brighter, the shadows around her began to move, whispering promises that sounded like opportunity and smelled like betrayal. Lagos, the city that once ignored her, now bent to greet her name. Nkem, the girl from Ayatoro, became a sensation overnight. Sponsors lined up with scholarships, the press with microphones, and politicians with carefully crafted smiles. She was the face of the new generation. The voice of the forgotten, they called her. A living testimony that poverty could birth power. Her new life sparkled with possibility, yet it carried a weight she had not prepared for. Her apartment in the city was small but beautiful. Polished floors, bright curtains, and a desk stacked with awards and letters of invitation. Every morning, she dressed in the fine clothes gifted by designers who wanted to be associated with her story. Yet beneath all the silk and lace, She still kept her mother's faded wrapper folded beneath her pillow, a talisman of humility, a reminder of the girl who once sold maize barefoot. Some nights she would clutch it in her sleep, whispering, "Don't let me forget." But the world does not let its new idols rest. Soon, the invitations multiplied. Youth conferences, university seminars, talk shows, even political rallies. Cameras flashed wherever she went. Her laughter filled television screens. Her speeches became hashtags. Yet with every event, every headline, she felt a little less like herself, and a little more like the version everyone wanted her to be. Polished, perfect, invincible. And then came the meeting that tested the roots of her rise. One humid evening, after a televised education summit, Nkem was invited to a private dinner by Minister Balogun, one of the country's most powerful officials. He was a man whose handshake could open any door, or close it forever. The restaurant glowed with wealth, the air heavy with perfume and politics. "My dear Nkem," he said smoothly, his gold ring glinting as he raised his glass. "You are a symbol of hope, but hope needs funding, doesn't it?" He slid a sleek envelope across the table. Inside was a contract, a deal that promised luxury, global travel, and a permanent media position under his influence. In exchange, she would publicly endorse a new education initiative, one she quickly realized was a front for embezzlement. Her breath caught. The same hand that had once scrubbed the floors of Lagos now trembled over an offer that could buy her 10 lifetimes of comfort. "Think of it as stability," the minister continued, his smile practiced, predatory. "You've worked hard, Nkem. Now let your success work for you." Her pulse thudded in her ears. For a moment, her reflection in the polished table seemed to split. One side dressed in the humility of her past, the other in the glittering promise of power. She thought of her mother's hands, calloused but honest, of Mr. Okoro's trembling voice under the baobab tree, teaching her that education is revenge that doesn't bleed. "Sir," she began, her voice low but steady, "you said you admire my story, but my story only matters if it remains true." His smile faded, replaced by irritation disguised as charm. "You're young. You'll learn that truth is flexible." She pushed the contract back toward him. "Then I'll choose to stay unbent." For a long moment, silence hung between them, heavy, electric, final. He gave a short, cold laugh. "You'll regret this." She stood, her chin high, her heart pounding. "Maybe. But at least the girl they laughed at will never laugh at herself." Outside, the night air was sharp with rain. The city lights shimmered through the storm, beautiful and distant. Nkem walked alone down the slick street, the sound of thunder following like applause from unseen ancestors. In her apartment that night, she unfolded her mother's wrapper and stared at it through tearful eyes. She had resisted the temptation of wealth, but deep down, a quiet fear began to rise. She was learning that power, once refused, does not disappear. It waits, and it always returns with a higher price. Sometimes life brings back the people who shaped us, not to remind us of where we came from, but to show us how far we've climbed. When Nkem heard the knock on her door that night, she didn't expect it to reopen the most sacred chapter of her past. Behind that door stood the man whose words had lifted her from humiliation to hope, the man whose lessons had built the very wings she now flew on. Destiny had found its way home, wearing the face of her first teacher, Mr. Okoro. For a moment, Nkem couldn't move. The world seemed to tilt, and the noise of the city fell away, leaving only her heartbeat and the trembling shadow of the man at her door. His frame was thinner now, his once steady shoulders bowed by time. His walking stick quivered with each breath, but his eyes, oh, those eyes, still burned with that same quiet strength that had once turned a poor girl's shame into fire. He smiled, though his lips trembled. "I told you," he whispered, "the world would one day fear your potential." Tears filled her eyes before words could. She fell to her knees, clutching his hands like holy relics. "Sir, you shouldn't have come all this way. I was going to find you, He gently raised his hand, silencing her. "No, child. I had to see it for myself. The girl they laughed at. Now the woman the whole nation admires." Nkem guided him inside, her hands shaking as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. The air between them was thick with memory, the red dust of Ayatoro, the laughter of cruel tongues, the old baobab tree that had witnessed both her humiliation and her first spark of courage. He sat by the window, the morning light painting his weathered face in gold. "They said you would speak for our country," he murmured. "You'll show the world what our small village raised." Nkem smiled faintly through her tears. "I wouldn't be here if you hadn't given me that chance, sir. You saw something in me when everyone else saw nothing." Mr. Okoro chuckled softly. "Ah, no. I only watered the seed. You did the growing." But as he spoke, she noticed how his hands shook more than before, how his breath came shallow, how the fire in his eyes flickered like a candle fighting the wind. It broke her heart to see the man who once stood like a pillar of strength now frail before her. She wanted to repay him, to give him comfort, care, honor. But how does one repay faith itself? "Sir," she whispered, "come with me. To Geneva. They must hear your story, too. You deserve the stage more than I do." He smiled sadly, shaking his head. "No, my dear. That stage is yours. I was only meant to teach the first chapter. You will write the rest." He reached into his old satchel and pulled out a small, wrapped bundle. "I kept this," he said softly. Inside was her first notebook. Pages yellowed with age, corners torn, but still carrying her childlike handwriting. On the first page, faint but visible, were the words she had written years ago under his guidance. "I will rise. I will not let them laugh forever." Her voice broke. "You kept it all these years?" "I did," he replied, his eyes misty. "Because it reminded me that hope can grow in any soil, even the kind watered by tears." For a long moment, neither spoke. The morning breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the faint sound of a distant church bell. Then Mr. Okoro said, "Do you remember what I told you that first day under the baobab?" She nodded. "That education is revenge that doesn't bleed." He smiled. "And now you've proven it. You've taught the world that our laughter, the laughter they used to break you, was never their victory. It was the sound before your beginning." Nkem wiped her tears, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Sir, if only they could see you now." "They don't need to," he replied. "They'll see me every time you speak." Outside, dawn was beginning to bloom. The sky blushed pink and gold, the kind of morning that feels like forgiveness. Mr. Okoro struggled to stand, and she rushed to help him. "You've given me everything," she said, holding his arm. "At least let me give you something in return." He looked at her for a long time, smiling gently. "Then promise me this, that you'll never let pride take the place of purpose. Let humility be your crown. That will be my reward." Nkem nodded, her tears silent now. "I promise." He touched her forehead in blessing. "Good. Then go, my child. Go, and let them see what a teacher's faith and a student's fire can build together." She watched him walk away slowly down the corridor, his shadow long against the rising sun. Every step he took felt like the closing of a sacred book. When he turned at the end of the hall and raised his hand, she whispered, "Thank you, sir," her voice breaking like dawn itself. As the plane lifted hours later, the golden light of sunrise washed over Nkem's face. She pressed her hand against her heart, feeling the small notebook beneath her jacket. Through her tears, she looked out the window and whispered, "We made it, sir." And in that quiet space between sky and earth, she swore she heard his voice, soft, proud, eternal. "Yes, Nkem. We did. Greatness is not born in comfort. It is sculpted from humiliation, molded by hunger, and lit by the stubborn light of hope that refuses to die even when the world laughs. Nkem had once walked barefoot through the red dust of Ayatoro, mocked for dreaming beyond her poverty. Now that same dust rose to greet her like a crown, carried by the footsteps of thousands who gathered to welcome home the woman their laughter had once tried to bury. The morning sun poured its gold across the village as the convoy of cars approached. Children ran ahead, chanting her name, Nkem, Nkem, the pride of Ayatoro, their voices echoing across the fields. Drummers lined the road, their rhythms fierce and joyful, the same drums that had once announced festivals she was too poor to attend. But today, they beat her. Banners bearing her image fluttered in the wind. The girl who became our hope. Inside the car, Nkem watched silently, her heart trembling. The woman the nation now admired was still the same girl inside, the one who had once counted coins to buy a pencil, the one who had prayed beneath the baobab tree, the one whose shame had become her strength. Her mother sat beside her, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "You see, my daughter," she whispered, "the same mouths that laughed now sing your name." Nkem smiled faintly. "And I will never forget why they laughed, Mama, because that laughter is what made me rise." When the car stopped at the edge of the market square, the noise was deafening. Drums, cheers, ululations blending into one voice of celebration. Nkem stepped out, dressed in a flowing white gown, woven with threads of gold, simple yet radiant. The people surged forward, reaching out to touch her, to hold her hands, to bless her, as if touching her might transfer a piece of her destiny to their own. The market itself seemed transformed, the stalls painted anew, the walls draped in fabric, the smell of roasted maize filling the air like memory reborn. Every corner carried a ghost of her past. There, near the well, was where she once spilled her maize and faced the laughter of the chief's wives. She could still hear their mocking voices, sharp and bright, cutting through her like knives. And there, by the mango tree, she had once sat with her mother, promising that one day they would not have to beg credit for food. As she walked through the crowd, her heart swelled with gratitude and sorrow all at once. Old men she had known as a child bowed low. Women clapped and sang, tears streaming down their faces. But one figure among them caught her eye. Madame Ajok, the merchant queen who had once humiliated her before the whole village. Ajok pushed her way forward, her face trembling with emotion. Her expensive lace wrapper was damp with sweat, her headscarf slipping from her head. When she reached Nkem, she fell to her knees, her voice breaking. "Forgive me, my daughter. I was blind then. I saw only your rags, not your spirit." The crowd fell silent. Even the drums stopped. All eyes turned to Nkem. She looked down at the woman who had once been the symbol of her shame. And for a moment she saw herself again, kneeling before power, small and voiceless. But that girl was gone. Nkem bent down and took Ajok's trembling hands, lifting her gently. "You owe me no apology," she said softly. "The laughter made me strong. Without it I would never have learned to fight for my own voice." Ajok sobbed openly, pressing Nkem's hands to her forehead. The crowd erupted in applause, some crying, some laughing. "She forgives! She forgives!" they chanted, as music surged again through the square. But for Nkem, the sound felt distant, like waves crashing against a shore she no longer belonged to. Later that day, she stood on a small stage built at the center of the market, addressing her people. Her voice carried across the air like the wind itself, calm, firm, filled with both pride and pain. "When I left this village," she said, "I carried your laughter in my ears. It hurt then, but today I thank you, because that laughter became my drumbeat. It pushed me to learn, to dream, to rise. I came back not to boast, but to build. Every child here deserves the same chance I was given." Cheers rose again, some people shouting her name, others chanting blessings. The elders nodded, proud and humbled all at once. Behind her on the stage stood a banner for the Nkem Obi Foundation, her dream turned into action. Through it, she had built schools in the poorest corners of the country, offering education to children who once had no hope. Her story had traveled beyond Nigeria, across Africa, across oceans, turning into a symbol of what resilience could create. But as the Auda Dio celebration grew louder, Nkem's eyes drifted toward the edge of the crowd. And there, standing barefoot in the dust, was a small girl holding a tray of roasted maize. Her clothes were torn, her hair unkempt, her eyes too old for her years. The girl stared at Nkem, not with awe, but with quiet hunger. Hunger for something she couldn't name. Their eyes met, and the noise around Nkem faded to silence. For a heartbeat, it was as if time folded in on itself. The woman and the child, the future and the past, staring at each other through the thin veil of destiny. Nkem felt her throat tighten. She saw herself in that child. The same defiance hidden behind fear, the same question trembling in her eyes. Will anyone see me? The girl's tray tilted slightly, and a few kernels of maize rolled into the dust. The crowd didn't notice, but Nkem did. She remembered that same shame, that same helplessness, and how a single act of kindness had once changed everything. Without thinking, Nkem stepped down from the stage and walked through the crowd toward the girl. The guards tried to stop her, but she raised her hand. The market fell silent again, all eyes following her every move. When she reached the girl, she knelt, her white gown brushing against the dirt, and picked up one fallen maize. She placed it back on the tray and smiled. "What is your name, child?" The girl hesitated. "Adana," she whispered. Nkem nodded. "Adana, do you go to school?" The girl shook her head slowly. "No, Ma. I sell maize for my mother." Nkem's voice softened, trembling with emotion. "Then from today, you will go to school, and one day you will tell your story, and maybe, just maybe, it will be greater than mine." The crowd erupted into cheers again, louder than before, but Nkem barely heard them. Her eyes remained on the girl, who now smiled shyly through her tears. As the drums thundered and the people chanted her name, Nkem looked up at the sky, whispering a silent prayer. Let the cycle of laughter end here. But somewhere deep in her heart, she felt it, the quiet stir of destiny turning once more, reminding her that every ending births another beginning, and the fire she carried was now passing to another barefoot dreamer, beneath the same sun. Every generation remembers one name that refused to die, one soul that turned humiliation into a hymn of hope. Before history called her the nation's light, she had been nothing more than a poor girl selling maize beneath the blazing sun, mocked until her tears hardened into diamonds. Now, years later, her story had grown into legend, a story mothers whispered to their daughters and teachers told their students whenever despair dared to whisper, "You are not enough." Time had not dimmed Nkem's glow. It had only deepened it. Her name had become a prayer across Africa, a living symbol of endurance. In villages, towns, and cities, her words hung on walls. Do not mock the Faye, poor. Tomorrow, they may be your teacher. Her foundation had built hundreds of schools across the continent, each one painted in the same bright colors as her childhood dreams. Children who once studied by candlelight now sat beneath solar lamps funded by her vision. She had become the bridge between suffering and strength, the embodiment of what grace could achieve when watered by pain. But even with global recognition, Nkem remained untouched by vanity. She wore her success like a borrowed robe, knowing the fabric of it had been sewn by every insult she'd ever endured. Reporters called her Africa's daughter of dignity, yet she still preferred to be called Nkem from Ayatoro. Her laughter was soft now, not the nervous laughter of a poor girl, but the calm laughter of someone who had made peace with the scars that built her. She turned down mansions and fame, choosing instead to live simply, in a modest house, surrounded by gardens and children's laughter. Visitors often found her sitting beneath an old mango tree, reading stories to orphans, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with peace. "Greatness," she told them, "is not in how many bow before you, but in how many rise because of you." On the 20th anniversary of her foundation, the government unveiled a bronze statue of her in Lagos. It was 10 feet tall, carved in her likeness, strong, regal, her gaze fixed toward the horizon. Beneath it, engraved in marble, were the words she had once written on the margins of her notebook under a flickering lantern. They laughed, but I listened to the wind instead. Crowds filled the square that day, chanting her name, waving banners, and singing songs written in her honor. Yet Nkem, standing before the statue, felt an ache in her heart. Not pride, but longing. She realized that every step forward had carried echoes of those she had left behind. Her mother, her teacher, her younger self. That evening, she asked her driver to take her back to Ayetro village, quietly, without fanfare. The road wound through fields of maize shimmering in the sunset, and the sight made her smile. The past no longer hurt. It had transformed into a familiar friend walking beside her. When she arrived, the villagers gathered instantly, whispering blessings as she passed. She smiled and greeted each one by name. Her eyes softened when she saw how the once-cracked marketplace now flourished. Stalls rebuilt, children running with books instead of baskets. Her foundation had rebuilt Ayatoro into a home of pride and learning. But even amidst all the change, one thing had remained: the ancient baobab tree. It stood tall and majestic, its roots deep in the same soil that had once soaked her tears. It was beneath this very tree that the story of the mocked girl had begun. The tree that had heard her whisper her first promise to the ancestors, the same one she had returned to year after year. She walked toward it, slowly, her heart full of reverence. The air was still, golden with dusk. She touched the trunk with trembling hands, her fingers tracing the grooves as though reading the memories carved into its bark. "You remember me, don't you?" she whispered, smiling faintly. "You remember the girl who swore she would rise." A breeze stirred, rustling the leaves above her, and for a moment it sounded like laughter, but not the cruel kind. This was softer, older, as though the ancestors themselves were smiling through the wind. Then she heard footsteps, light, hesitant. Turning, she saw a young girl standing a few feet away, barefoot, holding a basket of roasted maize. The girl's eyes were wide with recognition, her face sun-kissed, her dress faded but clean. She looked exactly as Nkem had once looked, small, fragile, but fierce with quiet defiance. "Are you Mama Nkem?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Nkem nodded gently. "Yes, my dear." The girl took a step forward. "My mother says they used to laugh at you. Is it true?" Nkem smiled, her eyes glistening. "Yes, they did. But the laughter did not break me. It built me." The girl tilted her head, curious. "Were you never angry?" "Angry," Nkem repeated softly. "Of course I was. But I learned that anger is like fire. If you hold it too long, it burns you before it burns them. So, I used it to light my path instead." The girl's lips parted in wonder. "I want to be like you one day." Nkem knelt before her, brushing the dust from the child's cheek. "You already are," she said gently. "You just don't know it yet." The girl smiled shyly, clutching her basket tighter. "Then I'll keep walking." "Yes," Nkem whispered. "Keep walking, even when they laugh." They stood together beneath the tree as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. For a moment, it was as if time itself bowed before them. The past and the future, standing hand in hand, beneath the same sky. As the first stars appeared, Nkem looked up and closed her eyes. The wind rose softly, circling them both, carrying her whisper through the branches. Rise. The word drifted across the village, across the fields, across time itself. And somewhere far away, another young girl lifted her face to the wind and felt it. That same whisper of destiny, calling her to walk the path the mocked girl once walked, and to keep the flame of courage alive. If this story moved your heart, don't let it fade. Share it so her strength can awaken someone else's courage. Tell me in the comments which moment touched you the deepest. Stay with us till the end of every story, because the next one might carry the truth your soul has been waiting for. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Don't be silent where hope still speaks.